Hello and welcome to The Price of Music, the show that looks at the money behind the music industry with me, Steve Lemack, and Music Allies Head of Insight, Stuart Dredge. It's another of our shows dedicated to answering some of your questions. So thanks everyone who's been in touch. Eyes down for a full house. We shall start with this question from Derek Howie. Great show about Bandcamp recently. I've used that platform for ages, as my favourite acts are pretty small scale, and I understand that any sale goes straight to the actual artist. However, thinking about physical product, I often wonder how sales of physical playback equipment like record players and hi-fis are doing. Do we know if sales of physical hi-fi equipment are going up along with record sales? And this is a good point, actually. Thank you, Derek. Given the increase in vinyl sales over the past decade, even if we do know that some people who buy records cheerfully admit to not owning a record player. In fact, there was a stat, I think, wasn't there? Billboard reported at one point, Billboard magazine in America claimed that half the record buyers in the States, half of them don't have a record player. Half of all vinyl collectors don't have anything to play those records on. But this has been it's a surprisingly difficult question to answer, this one, as it goes, Derek. In fact, Stuart's been pursuing the answer to this for what seems like about 4 weeks now. I don't know how far you've managed to get with any of this, Stuart.
Not very far. You say it's surprisingly hard. So there's one company that tracks audio hardware called GFK, and they haven't replied yet. So I'm hoping maybe one of them will be listening to this and going, oh, maybe we should reply to that guy. I found one stat from a German research company from 2020 saying that turntable sales that year grew by 10%, but the money paid for them grew by 20%.
Right.
So they would move. There's lots of made up stats from market research companies that I avoid, like you can find. I was thinking, and I found a 2015 article on John Lewis. So, this is what people come here for, I think.
Yeah.
So in 2015, turntable sales at John Lewis grew by 240% in the first quarter of that year. So this is what I can say. It's a long-term trend. It's not like a recent years thing. Mm-hmm. This has been going on over the past decade. But yeah, it's really hard. And as for cassette players, no idea. No one's tracking that, which seems like a shame. Because
do you know what I think? I bought it's a difficult one. I bought a new double cassette deck last year, and almost identical to the one that I'd had for 20 years. But the choice, obviously, is very sparse now. But those portable cassette players, there's more of those around, but I don't think it would be a huge rise. I've not compared to record players. I see a lot of my friends now posting pictures of their their new turntables, their fancy new turntables, as they're returning from a record shop on a Friday with their new purchases.
Glass of wine next to a turntable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we think record player sales are doing well and possibly on the up. But as soon as we get more information, we'll update you on that. But thank you, Derek. Question from Glyn Hayward. How do new bands like me get onto playlists, and how can I use the platforms from an exposure perspective? I have never, says Glyn, I've never been so bombarded with so many music promotion ads for services saying, if you pay X, we can guarantee we can get you on X playlists, radio stations, and grow your following by X. And all the services seem to be saying they're better than each other. It's an absolute headache, says Glyn. Thank you very much. I would love to know what X figure is when it comes to the money that you're being quoted to use one of these services. I mean, not just because I'm nosy, but because it might actually have some bearing on whether you decide to use one of them or not. But the thing is, this question has an awful lot of angles to it. So I'm going to try and break them down so we can deal with them point by point, particularly with reference to radio, and then Stuart will help you out with some practical advice on the streaming services. But for starters, no promotions company, I don't think, can actually guarantee that they'll get your track, particularly if it's a track by a new or unknown artist, onto certainly a radio playlist. And I suspect the same might be true of some streaming platforms as well, at least when it comes to a meaningful playlist, one that might actually have some impact on your career. And if they say, no, we can guarantee we'll get you onto so-and-so list, I think something something fishy might be afoot. But anyway, just be careful, I think, of the claims they're making, and always, if you can, check to see who they have represented before and what their track record is, because essentially what you're paying for is for someone who has a relationship with the people who compile the playlists or contribute towards them. So you're essentially paying for an in that you don't have. That's the theory. In reality, obviously, that in can vary quite wildly. So I think that's what you have to be careful about, because what you really want is to be represented by someone who has a personal relationship with someone who's got a key role in deciding those playlists, or at least can talk to them or email them and try and get your record at least heard. Alternatively, there are companies who will simply send your track out to a mailing list of contacts that they've built up in the hope that the song might stick. That's certainly the case in radio. How do streaming services choose their songs? I guess that varies quite a bit, does it, Stuart?
Yeah, I mean, there are people within the streaming services who run playlists, who curate them in the same way that playlists do in radio. And there was a time when people were eventually there were streaming pluggers. So I know the person at Spotify who does this playlist. I don't know. I think it's exactly the same as you said for radio. Really, if you've got a company as you're saying, right, well, who do you know? Which playlists? What can you get me on? Because if it's not the big playlists that are being created at those services, it could be any playlist. It could be ones that they've made, in which that have like 2 followers. So I think with everything, just go and say, right, who, how, why, what evidence of success have you got? But in streaming, the other thing is, so Spotify has actually a playlist submission tool. So if you Google Spotify campaign kit, you can find it. And then when you upload a song, you can there's a form you can fill in to pitch it and say, I want it to pitch it to these playlists. So they actually have an automated way, and then that will go to the relevant editors. And obviously you're just sending this form off into a void. You don't really know if it'll make them there, but that's what they advise doing. I think the other thing is, when you get to a point where you do have some audience, is understanding what kind of pings the radar of the algorithms and the people in these services. And it's stuff like, are people playing your music? Are they not skipping it? Are they saving your tracks to libraries and putting them on their own playlists? So that's something where when you have an audience and you have a song out, just be very, very kind of good on socials and say, right, we've got a new song out. You can add it here. Please add it to your playlist. Tell your friends. The same thing we do with podcasts, really. Those little things you do to kind of spread the word. Because those are the signs that tell Spotify something is happening with this song. People like it who've heard it already. So it's a kind of, there's no magic kind of, here's how you get on this playlist. It's all little work you can do to kind of build momentum and then show you're building momentum. One thing I see quite a lot is when people do get on a playlist at a streaming service, they promote that on socials saying, I'm really pleased I've been added to Apple Music's playlist about this, tag them in on it. So doing all that stuff around what's happening. But yeah, I don't think there is a quick fix. I think anyone telling you we can get you on playlists you need to ask them for evidence. Anyone saying we'll get you a number of streams, that is even more worth being wary of, because there's a big crackdown on streaming manipulation in the industry now. So if someone is saying pay us money and we'll get you 1 million streams, that's best avoided, because you could end up getting punished and not finding listeners you want.
I think that what the promotions companies are doing is they are offering you or making you believe that there is a shortcut. So they're going to shortcut the system for you. And you're right, Glenn, because we'll look into this a little bit more. I've not had the time over the last couple of days, but I did, out of interest, I clicked on one of the ads for one of these companies that you're talking about, who say they can get you on a Spotify playlist. I clicked on one, and then the next day I had about 3 more targeted ads from 3 different companies, all offering the same service, all again making claims about breaking artists through streaming platforms, and some of them have got, endorsements and testimonies from people who've used the service before, none of whom I'd ever come across myself. So I don't know. I really don't know how it's, as I say, all we can recommend is that you check the form of the company if you can, and then consider how much, whether the money that you would need to spend, whether you think it'll be worth it if they can achieve what they claim they're going to achieve. I think that's, we'll update you, as I say, when we can, when we know a bit more about how they operate. To the other part of Glyn's question, though, where Glyn says, how can I use the platforms from an exposure perspective? Again, I think this depends on what playlist you get on, how well regarded it is by fans or people in the industry. Because if you get on the Six Music playlist, say, as an artist, as a new artist, your phone may start to ring, your inbox will be low-level assaulted by people wanting to know more about you. But if you're just on, a minor playlist or an internet radio station's top 10, I mean, I'm not saying it'll have no impact, but it'll have less impact. And then as I say, then does the ripple of interest that you've created through this, does it justify the amount you've spent? That's constantly the question you have to ask. I think that's fair.
There's actually, there's one thing I would call out. SoundCloud have a thing called First Fans. You can only use it if you're an artist subscribed to SoundCloud, if you subscribe to their Next Pro service, which is their kind of their tier of things. But they have a thing where basically when you upload a track, they will analyze it with their AI and they'll match it to, I think it's 1,000 people who should like it, and they'll pop it in their streams. So streaming services are starting to think about this. Okay, where someone uploads a track, it's got 0 plays. How can we get it in front of people who might like it? And then SoundCloud talked recently about how songs that do well there, if people like the tracks, if they mark them as liked, add them to playlists, then they get put into some of their playlists. So they've worked out this scheme of like how we're gonna see what's good. We'll put it out in front of people, and then we'll put it in our playlists based on data. So much of the playlist is about data now, seeing if something is working, if people like it. And again, there is no shortcut. But if Glyn's on SoundCloud and if he's paying for SoundCloud as an artist, investigate First Fans, because that could be get you some listeners and get you some traction there.
I think as well, when it comes to the exposure you get, if you are lucky enough to get on a playlist, and you do put yourself in front of a bigger audience, chances like that don't come along all the time. And unfortunately, the music industry, with so much music out there, does tend to take one look at you, and if it doesn't happen for you, then they just move on and they don't come back to look at you again. This was a point that came up in our interview with Tom Robinson a few weeks back. So you've got to have everything ready to go, I think, before you push the button to start a promotional campaign. I think that's worth it. Otherwise, you might create an opportunity which you're not ready to take. So it depends where you are in your career, really, I guess, Glyn. Yeah. But
the other thing as well is I think a lot of the Spotify, the creators of streaming services, they're kind of like you, Steve, I think, in that they're out and about at gigs a lot. They're looking for stuff live. And obviously the difficulty is if they're all based in London, you get the age-old question of, is it just London? People get discovered. But the people who create the playlists at the big streaming services, they are out and about looking for new music. So if you are playing live, if you're getting out and about, that's another way they can find you. And it's organic then. You're not paying someone to do it. You're just playing really well at a gig, and someone in the crowd is actually in a position to put you on playlists. So, that's also another way.
Glyn, I hope that helps. But if you have a follow-up question, if there's something which you'd like us to delve into more, I mean, I could talk about radio plugging for literally hours if anyone's interested. But do get back in touch, Glyn. And if there's anyone listening who's had experience of any of these promo firms which you might care to share with us, which might be helpful for fellow musicians, just drop us an email and we'll share your thoughts with the rest of the gang. What's next? Oh, here's something else we could talk about for hours. This is quite a difficult one. This is more theory probably than the price of music. This is more one of those, what is music? Or in this case, from Femi, who's been in touch, what is the definition of an independent label? To which my answer is, how long is a piece of string? Sorry, Femi. What's the definition of an independent label? Do you want to start, Stuart?
Yeah, do you know, I met Femi at the BPI's conference, and he said he was going to send his question in. So I'm glad you have. Thank you.
Right.
Because he's a very nice man. He came up to me and said he liked the podcast and he had a question.
Right. Okay. Let's do our best.
Yeah. So look, the simple answer is it's anyone who's not Universal, Sony, or Warner. Like that, there are three major labels, and everyone else in theory is independent. There was a time when BMG were branding themselves as the fourth major. But if you look at the figures, that I was looking at the revenues, Universal made about 9.3 billion quid last year. BMG made 761 million. Beggars Group made 52.5 million. And then, like Femi says, there are labels making 100 grand a year. So you've got these kind of layers, but everyone outside the majors is independent in theory. The caveat is in some countries, the biggest labels aren't the three major labels. So we actually talked about Hyde from South Korea in a recent show. In theory, they're independent, but they're big. They're huge in their own home market. Avex in Japan is another example of someone who's an independent label, but is a huge dominant player. But I did go, so I went looking at some of the independent label bodies to see how they define it. So I went to look at AIM, which is the indie body here in the UK. And they say an independent music business is one which is not a major, so not one of the three majors, and is not more than 49% owned by a major. So if a major label owns more than half of your stock, you're not indie. So AIM members can have deals with majors, including like joint ventures, but they have to control at least 50% of their company to meet the definition of independent. And in the US, there's a body called A2AM, and they're basically the same. So any US recordings owner or controller whose business is less than 50% major ownership, which is kind of a thing now because you're seeing major labels buy. We talked about Maven Records, for example, the Afrobeats label, and Universal buying a majority stake in them. So you're seeing major labels buy stakes, which has kind of happened before, hasn't it? In the past, there have been independent labels that were kind of owned by majors, and it was,
Yeah, and if not owned, they'll do an international licensing deal, or they'll find some way of being involved in an independent label, which probably needs some investment or practical help in getting records. In the old days, getting records out around the world. It's interesting because part of Femi's question, because Femi's asking, is it right to classify indies like Beggars and BMG and PS in the same category as micro labels with a turnover of less than 100k? And the reason Femi's asking this is, Femi says, in my view, that the terms of what an independent label is need to be more accurate. Because in turn this may govern industry policies and regulations. But the agendas of large indie companies, mostly internationals, are now far removed from the grassroots labels in the UK. So I think it's that point that, yes, although independence in theory, all labels outside of the three big majors are independent labels, but the point is, some of them are less independent than others. Well, they're all independent, but some of them are massive operations rather than being a bedroom label. I mean, honestly, there's a whole think piece in this. This might finally be the time when we start a Substack just so we can write 5,000 words about this.
We did.
But because the thing is that going back years, what you were saying about labels buying independence, though that happened a little bit in the 90s. I remember when I was at the New Musical Express, this was also the point where major labels started up independent labels. So it was owned, and they became nicknamed Mandies because they were in the independent chart and operated independently, but fully financed by a major label. But really at that point, the definition, I think, of who was independent was simply down to whether you were distributed by an independent distributor if you didn't go through the major system. And I'm not sure if that still holds water. Yeah.
Well, the thing now is that the majors all own independent distributors. So, for example, Sony owns The Orchard, the independent. So The Orchard is not an independent music company under the definition of AIM because it's owned by Sony. But you can be an independent label who's distributing through The Orchard, and you are independent. You're just using their services. And that stuff, there's often been discussion about that, about what does it mean when major labels are buying independent distributors. I was remembering, probably in those days you were talking about, do you remember, I don't know if it's Enemy or Melody Maker used to publish the indie charts every week.
Yeah.
And it was always Kylie Minogue at the top because she was signed to PWL, which was an independent, I think.
Yes.
And I remember being that snotty little indie kid going, Kylie Minogue's not indie. although she had an indie album, didn't she? But that was in those days. That was that thing where she was an independent artist, topping the indie chart. But yet, indie was also the genre, so it all gets quite tangled. But it's weird because I feel like, to Femi's question, what he's saying is he wants the micro labels to be represented, have their interests represented, and so I guess the question there is, what can AIM, the independent labels body, what can the BPI, the labels body overall, are they doing as good a job as they could be of representing those micro labels? Mm-hmm. Do they need to have people on their board? I know I don't know the question to that, and I'm not accusing them, but I'm guessing that's the thing of other bodies that represent the industry. Are they representing those smaller labels as well as he would like them to be? And maybe that's one for further discussion.
Want a website with unmatched power, speed, and control? Try Bluehost Cloud, the new web hosting plan from Bluehost, built for WordPress creators by WordPress experts. With 100% uptime, incredible load times, and 24/7 WordPress priority support, your site will be lightning fast with global reach. And with Bluehost Cloud, your sites can handle surges in traffic no matter how big. Plus, you automatically get daily backups and world-class security. Get started now at bluehost.com.
Yeah, I think that's the point. Yeah, because the independent world is so big now. I mean, I still think. I mean, if you take something like the Beggars Group, which started in a record shop, that came out of a record shop, didn't it? Obviously, has now grown into a much bigger and international set of companies. But it's still in the same independent world as someone who's running a label out of a bedroom in Hitchin, but just on a very different scale. And I think
the optimists.
I'm sorry. I'm going to end up at this sooner or later, so I might as well just say it out loud now, however cringeworthy this sounds. But it's a state of mind. Independence is a state. It's how you go about things. Because however big, say, a label like Domino Records gets, which is another label which started in Lawrence Bell's flat in West London and is now obviously quite a well-known label and has had international success with the likes of Arctic Monkeys, but it retains an independent ethos. So it's, how are we going to judge what an independent is? Is it a frame of reference, a state of mind, or is it down to purely size and turnover?
Yeah, but it's weird. I had two things to say actually. One was, and we've talked before about how I'm an optimist, but I feel like the people who run those labels, Beggars, Domino, they do remember where they came from, and I don't think of them as people who now just lobby for labels their size. I feel like they have a sense of responsibility for the labels smaller than them. And when I've talked to them in the past, I do sense there is that strong sort of, we know where we came from. And when we're going in, and we now are big enough to talk to government and to get involved in lobbying, but we're doing it on behalf of those, which is, people might be more skeptical and say, well, but, are you ever not thinking about your own rights first, But I feel like those people, that's the sense I've got of them. But the other thing is, it's getting more complicated still, because you've got artists who are independent themselves. They don't have a label. They're running their business themselves. And so if you're an independent artist going the DIY route, you kind of are an independent label too. You're running your own cottage label.
I mean, just picking up on one of those points, I think it's worth remembering with something like AIM, because it represents independent labels from the very top to the very bottom, and is a very an inclusive organisation, but a big organisation because it includes the big players as well as the smaller ones. It has more clout when it comes to negotiating on behalf of independent music. And it's a careful what you wish for, because if the micro labels were to say, well, we're the truly independent ones, and so we'll be separate from everything else, then you will have less clout when it comes to negotiating deals in the industry, surely. Or is that
this is where something like Merlin comes in, which licenses streaming services and it negotiates on behalf of lots of independents, smallest to big. And so that was set up, I think, to do that, to say, right, together, the independent sector has lots of clout. We're equal to one of the majors. And so people have been thinking about this throughout the streaming era, I think, of thinking, right, how do we negotiate together so that the smallest labels don't get bullied by digital services?
Mm-hmm.
So there is but I think Femi can probably tell us whether he thinks that's working or what more needs to be done. I think maybe this is a conversation there. I almost was thinking maybe we need an extra industry body, but I think we should always run away from that idea of having yet another. But I do think there are the bodies representing labels. I think it would be interesting to talk to them sometime about how do you represent those small labels and how do you balance those interests, because it is a good question.
Do you know what? Do you know what I think we do need? I think we need about 5 hours in a pub to fully debate this and to work out whether we should measure independent labels on turnover or, as I say, on their approach, their ethos. But anyway, get in touch if you have any thoughts on this. Thank you, Femi. Finally, for this episode, a question from Kieran Maguire from The Price of Football. Hello, Kieran. Thank you for this. You will know if you listen to The Price of Football as well as sister podcast that Kieran is always off going to see gigs, particularly by bands of a certain era, as you'll be able to tell from this. Kieran says The Cure on their most recent tour teased the audience with material from their supposed next album, Songs of a Lost World. Yet 18 months later, no sign of a release. The Sisters of Mercy have been playing new material at gigs since 1990's Vision thing. But again, nothing available to buy or download apart from pirate recordings. Is the economics of putting out a new album so onerous that many bands decide that it's just not worth the effort of setting aside studio time to record and instead focus their efforts on touring? Kieran, I mean, I can't speak for Sisters of Mercy. Well, I can't speak for The Cure either, but the rumours of a new Cure record have been around, as you say, have been around for actually what feels like about 3 years now. So I don't think it's economics in their case holding things up. And I'm 99% sure you will get a new Cure album. From the whispers I'm hearing, it is done and ready for release. But when is anyone's guess? Because as a Cure fan, Kieran, you probably already know this, but Robert Smith from The Cure plays things very close to his own chest. Really, even the label, I think, constantly in the dark as to when the Cure records might be coming. But there was another story doing the rounds that Robert was renegotiating the catalogue rights for the Cure and wanted to sort that out before releasing a new album. And I believe that deal has now been done. Which might explain the recent announcement of a new acoustic hits album. Well, it's an old acoustic hits album, but it's finally coming onto the streaming platforms. Their album Acoustic Hits from 2001. But if the catalogue deal is done, then I think the possibility of a new record from The Cure coming sooner rather than later has probably just gone up a notch. Having said that, they'll also want, obviously, to work out a time when they can get maximum exposure out of it. So we shall see. The only person who will be able to tell you is Robert Smith, and I've not heard from him for years. So
should we get him on?
Can't help it. Yeah.
Can I now go down the Sisters of Mercy rabbit hole? Because
yes, you can.
Kieran sent me down a rabbit hole of Andrew Eldritch interviews to kind of research this, and he has been I feel like he's done every interview he's done since the last album came out. People asking him, where's the new material?
Yeah.
And so back in 2016, he talked about the idea that the main problem was it takes a lot of work and effort, and he didn't feel like music had any value. No one wanted to pay for it, and there was too much noise. So he was saying then, I've thought about crowdfunding, but nothing's decided. But it was about the industry, really, and not seeing the point. And then later on, he talked about the music industry is so truly and utterly fucked that I can't see them managing it in terms of putting a record label out.
Really?
And then he said, but the best quote is, he said, this is before Donald Trump became president last time. He said, if Donald Trump actually becomes president, that will be reason enough for me to release another album. I don't think I could keep quiet if that happened. Mm-hmm. So, maybe Trump will become president for a second time and that will nudge his hand. I'm not sure if that's compensation, really. well, Trump's president again, but interesting. So I was thinking about more generally. So like you say, we can't talk for The Cure or Sisters of Mercy, but one thing I think that's happened since COVID is that bands have been rushing to get back on the road with big tours and touring as many continents as possible, which, get out, play as many dates as you can, as many places as possible. And that can put a dent in writing and recording time. And I think there are a few albums mainly that have been shelved so they can go out and get some money in on the road.
Mm.
And then a weird thing.
Yeah, that's true. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah.
But the other thing I think is it's like streaming is really outside a few, like Apple Music likes to talk about albums, but really streaming is about tracks. It's a track centric world. And you have to release tracks regularly to get on playlists and so on. Like in a way, making albums, it fits awkwardly into the way streaming works nowadays. But artists still like to make albums, and they still like to say, no, this is a project, a fully formed project of 12 songs or however many. But I sometimes wonder if putting out an album can become a big thing, and the longer it gets delayed, the bigger a thing it is, the bigger millstone it is, that you've got to get it right and have it perfectly formed. And I wonder if that can sometimes happen where you're thinking, I've got to make this album perfect, when if you're doing new music, maybe you should just put a track out every so often and make it less of the new album by this band, and making it a big, maybe that can put too much pressure of expectations on. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think all this comes down to the individual artist, because in some ways, and coming back to Kieran's question about, is it financially, does it make any sense? I think with vinyl sales particularly doing so well, and even, quite buoyant CD sales, for a lot of artists of this era, it's actually never been a better time to put out a record. But partly you've got various options of how you do it as well, but particularly if you are of interest to some of these labels, there are a lot of labels now who have forged a very successful path to putting out records and getting them straight to the fans. If you think of, somebody like Cooking Vinyl, the label Cooking Vinyl, have been doing this. They were trailblazers with this, really, taking artists who had a fan base, but not necessarily, weren't hip young gunslingers anymore, but making records with bands who they could easily find an audience for, where there's still people who are interested in them. So you've got Cooking Vinyl. And Cooking Vinyl, for instance, if you take as an IE, Shed 7 have just early in the year had their first #1 album through putting out a record with Cooking Vinyl, and shows, one, that there's still an interest and a demand and a fan base who want a new Shed 7 record, and two, the label didn't manage to do it very efficiently, the release and the marketing of it. And you've got BMG as well. BMG are doing similar things now. They've got various heritage artists, and I think if a label is convinced that they can at least break even on a heritage band's record, they're up for doing it, I think. Alternatively, if you're a band, if you were Andrew Eldritch, you could, if you had the money, if you come back from tour and you've got the money, you could make the record yourself and then license it to a label while retaining the rights to the music as well. So there's loads of options, and I think there's interest, and I think there are financial ways of doing it. It just comes down to whether you want to do it, whether Andrew Eldritch thinks he can be bothered, whether it's financially worth it to make a record.
I've got another good quote from Andrew Eldritch. He's a very interesting guy, actually. He said, if you put out records, people say, why aren't you touring? And if you're touring, people say, why aren't you putting out records? And he said, the simple fact is, whatever we do, it's not entirely broken, so we're not entirely looking to fix it. So I think that's the thing. If what you do is working for you, then those old norms of you have to release an album every 18 months. So, you can find what works for you. But the other thing that's interesting here, I think, is that we're in this era when if you play new songs live, chances are someone is shooting a video in the crowd and they'll put it online, and when you've got like a fan base who they'll be gathering and like picking over the new songs. So you probably can go somewhere now and get links to all the video clips from the Cure concerts of their new songs and listen to them. And it kind of creates buzz, doesn't it, around it? Like I've had that with bands I like, where it's like, oh, they played a new song at this concert, someone's put it on Instagram. So in a way, maybe it's a slow burn of playing, seeing what the reaction is. I remember, oh God, should we go into the nostalgia corner? I remember seeing Blur at Mile End, and I think they played Globe Alone and Country House off the next record at the time. And I think Globe Alone was maybe going to be the single, and it was the crowd reaction to Country House. It was our fault that they released Country House. So sometimes that can be the thing. You're playing it to get that feedback from fans on, do they like it? Is this good? I don't know if that's a System Mercy case. He seems pretty confident in what he's doing, but
it's only just occurred to me that you couldn't have chosen two more enigmatic artists, could you? Robert Smith and Andrew Eldritch, who probably like to ramp up the drama as well as much as anything else. The longer you don't release a record, the bigger the mystique about it. In a good
also
way,
not be told what to do.
Pressure on.
I don't think either of them like being told what to do, whether that's by fans or industry people. I think they'll do it when they're ready, and we'll. But yeah, I got Robert Smith quote as well about the new album. He said, "It doesn't have very much light on it. Unfortunately, it's pretty relentless, which will appeal to the hardcore audience, but I don't think we'll be getting any number one singles off it. Emotionally, it's been quite harrowing. So if anyone's planning for it to be a party record, I'd maybe set your expectations accordingly.
Yeah.
It's going to be a hardcore Cure record.
But it'll come eventually. It's there and waiting, Kieran. And who knows? I mean, as an outside bet, just pencil it down on your Christmas list. There you go. Thank you very much for listening. That's it for another episode. If you have enjoyed this show, please do subscribe in your podcast app and give us a review and a rating, and maybe tell a couple of other people about it. That would be lovely. You can also support the show via our Patreon page, where you can become a Price of Music fan or super fan for as little as £2 a month. Just go to patreon.com/thepriceofmusic to find out more. And if you have a question, as well as our correspondence this week, which you'd like answered on the show, email them to us, thepriceofmusicpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks very much, everybody. Till next time, cheerio.